The voice of the devil was supposedly recorded. This is not a legend. These are not simply stories told years later. The recordings actually exist. They were captured in 1975 during the exorcism sessions of a 23-year-old German woman named Anneliese Michel. For nearly 50 years, these tapes have been presented as one of the most disturbing documents ever connected to an exorcism. Some people believe they contain proof of a presence that could not have been human. Others hear something completely different. The tragic testimony of a young woman in deep suffering, surrounded by people convinced they were facing something supernatural. But after studying this case in depth, I discovered something even more disturbing. The real mystery may not be what was recorded on those tapes. The real mystery is what happened before someone ever pressed the record button. Because before the prayers, before the priests, before the exorcism, there was a young woman, a family, a diagnosis, and a question that no one has ever truly been able to answer. What really happened to Anneliese Michel?
My name is Victor, and when I opened this case for the first time, I thought I already knew the story. A young woman, an exorcism, controversial recordings. Like many people, I had already heard about Anneliese Michel. But while studying the documents from that time, I discovered that the story everyone tells actually begins much too late. Because if we start directly with the exorcism sessions, we might be missing the most important part. The question is not only, what happened during those sessions? The first question is, how did an ordinary young woman end up in that room, where priests were trying to remove something they believed was inside her? To understand that, we have to go back several years, to a time when nobody was talking about exorcism. Anneliese Michel was a young student living in Bavaria, West Germany. She was 23 years old. She was quiet, deeply religious. And according to the people who knew her, there was nothing to suggest that her name would one day become associated with one of the most controversial cases in modern history. She had plans. She wanted to become a teacher. She had a normal life, a life that looked like the lives of many young women her age. Then, in 1968, something changed. Anneliese suffered a sudden and severe episode. She lost consciousness. Her body became rigid. Her family became worried. Doctors began a series of examinations. After several consultations, their conclusions seemed clear. Anneliese was suffering from epilepsy. For the medical world, this explanation provided an answer. There was a diagnosis, a treatment, a medical follow-up. For a while, everything seemed to make sense. But one detail would gradually complicate that explanation, because Anneliese began describing experiences that the people around her found increasingly difficult to understand. She claimed she could hear voices. At first, doctors believed this could be connected to her neurological condition. That explanation seemed reasonable. But over time, her descriptions changed. She was no longer talking only about sounds. She was talking about a presence, something she felt was outside of herself, something she claimed she could not control. And from that moment, two completely different interpretations began to emerge. For doctors, the search for a medical explanation had to continue. For her family, some elements seemed to go beyond that explanation. But one detail is especially important. The people who would eventually request an exorcism did not believe in possession from the beginning. Contrary to what is sometimes portrayed, this story did not start with a family immediately convinced they were facing a demonic presence. The first priests they contacted urged caution. They recommended that Anneliese continue her medical treatment. In other words, 7 people who believed in the supernatural did not immediately consider this an obvious case of possession. For several years, no definitive answer appeared. A disease? Psychological suffering? An experience influenced by her beliefs? Or something that nobody could truly explain? The situation remained unresolved, until one decision changed everything. A decision that would transform a private family tragedy
into one of the most famous cases of exorcism in modern history. Permission for an exorcism was eventually requested, and most importantly, for the first time, what happened inside that room would be recorded. At that moment, nobody could have imagined how important that decision would become, because from that point on, the Anneliese Michel case would enter a completely different phase. There would no longer be only memories, no longer only testimonies told years later. There would now be a record, hours of recordings, voices, conversations, moments that would be listened to and analyzed for decades. But before becoming one of the most controversial documents ever connected to exorcism, these tapes were simply an archive, a way to preserve a record of what was happening during the sessions. Nobody inside that room knew yet that they would become the center of a worldwide debate. The first sessions began in September 1975. Inside a small room in Germany, Anneliese Michel found herself facing two priests responsible for conducting the rituals. Beside them, a tape recorder captured every session. At first, the objective was simple: to preserve a record, to document the prayers, to allow those present to remember exactly what had taken place. This was not a recording intended for the public. It was not an attempt to convince anyone. It was simply a document. But quickly, the people attending the sessions began noticing things they considered unusual. According to their testimonies, Anneliese sometimes appeared to change dramatically. Her way of speaking, her attitude, her reactions. Everything seemed different from the young woman they knew. For her family, something was happening, something they could not explain. For the priests present, some of these reactions also raised questions. They observed, they searched for answers, they asked more questions, and gradually, their interpretation of the situation began to change. But this is where the case becomes particularly complex, because the same events would be interpreted in two completely opposite ways. For those who believed in a supernatural explanation, these changes were a crucial sign. According to them, Anneliese was not simply a person suffering from an illness. They believed another presence was expressing itself through her. For them, the sessions revealed something beyond human explanation.
But another interpretation exists. People who have studied the case point out that human behavior can become extremely complex during periods of intense suffering. Fear, stress, religious beliefs, a person's environment. All of these elements can influence the way someone experiences and expresses a traumatic situation. And in Anneliese Michel's case, one detail makes everything even more complicated. She lived in a deeply religious environment. Her family did as well. And the priests around her naturally interpreted these events through a spiritual framework. So a question begins to emerge. When someone experiences something they cannot understand, are they simply describing what they feel? Or do their beliefs influence the way they interpret what is happening to them? This question sits at the center of the entire case. But among all the elements reported during the sessions, one detail would quickly attract attention: the voices. Because according to several witnesses, Anneliese did not always seem to speak in the same way. Some claimed they noticed changes in her tone, in her behavior, in the way she responded. Some people present even described what they believed sounded like several different voices. For those who believed in a supernatural explanation, this was the moment when their doubts began to disappear. Because if these voices were not simply coming from Anneliese, then one question became impossible to ignore: who was speaking through her? But the changes in behavior and the variations in voice were not the only elements that disturbed the people present, because as the sessions continued, another detail began to attract their attention. Certain words spoken during the exchanges, answers given to the priest's questions, information that, according to some witnesses, seemed difficult to explain through a simple medical interpretation. And this is the point where the case truly changed. Because from that moment, the sessions were no longer described only as moments of crisis or suffering. They became a dialogue, questions being asked, answers being heard, words that would be analyzed for decades. But before reaching any conclusion, we need to understand what was actually said during those exchanges. Because behind the most sensational stories, there are also specific details, questions, answers, moments that deeply affected the people inside that room. And this is where the Anneliese Michel case would enter an even more disturbing territory. Because the question would no longer simply be, what can we hear on these tapes? But, what was actually answering the questions asked during those sessions?
As the sessions continued, the priests tried harder and harder to understand what was truly happening inside that room. They were no longer simply reciting the prayers of the exorcism. They were asking questions. They were searching for answers. They wanted to know what they were actually facing. And this is precisely what made these recordings so controversial. Because the tapes do not contain only screams. They do not contain only moments of distress. They also contain exchanges, conversations between the priests and what they believed was a presence different from Anneliese herself. According to available transcripts of the sessions and testimonies from people who were present, the priests first attempted to identify what was responding through her. One question appears repeatedly. Who are you? The answers reported in some documents mention several names: Judas, Cain, Nero, Adolf Hitler, and other figures associated with evil in religious imagery. For the people present during the sessions, this detail was deeply disturbing, because they did not feel they were witnessing only the symptoms of an illness. They believed they were facing something that had its own identity, something that was trying to communicate. But the questions were not only about identity. The priests also tried to understand why this presence was there, why it remained connected to Anneliese, why it refused to leave. According to accounts connected to the sessions, some responses referred to themes of suffering, punishment, and a refusal to leave Anneliese's body. For the priests present, these exchanges strengthened their belief. They no longer thought they were dealing with only a medical phenomenon. They believed they were communicating with something that had its own intentions. Another element would also attract their attention: the way the voices appeared to change. According to several witnesses, the responses heard during the sessions did not always seem to have the same tone. Some voices sounded different. Some reactions seemed different. Some witnesses even claimed they felt they were hearing several distinct personalities. For them, it was not only a question of voices, it was a question of identity. If several voices appeared to respond, then another question immediately emerged. Who was truly speaking through Anneliese? But this is exactly where the case becomes difficult to analyze, because the same elements that convinced some people did not convince everyone. People who studied the case offered another interpretation. They pointed out that Anneliese was deeply religious. Her family was as well, and the priests who accompanied her shared this spiritual worldview. That meant they were naturally interpreting the events through a very specific religious framework. When someone experiences something extremely intense, the way they understand what is happening also depends on what they believe is possible. A person can feel a presence. A person can hear voices. A person can experience something that feels completely real to them. But the interpretation of that experience can vary. For some, it may be a medical or psychological phenomenon. For others, it may be a spiritual event. This is probably what makes this case so difficult to classify. Because nobody denies that Anneliese was suffering. Nobody denies that the sessions happened. Nobody denies that people were present inside that room. The disagreement concerns a much deeper question. What actually explained what they saw and heard? For the priests and those convinced by a supernatural explanation, the recorded exchanges represented proof that another presence was involved. For those who defended a medical or psychological interpretation, the same recordings showed a young woman in extreme suffering, whose experiences were interpreted through her own beliefs and those of the people around her. And perhaps this is where the true mystery of the case can be found, not only in the voices, not only in the words recorded on the tapes, but in this question: How can people standing in the same room, listening to the same answers, reach two completely opposite conclusions? But while this debate began dividing those who studied the case, another reality became impossible to ignore. The sessions continued, again and again, for several months. And while the questions remained unanswered, Anneliese's physical condition began to deteriorate. Because soon, the case would no longer only concern what was heard inside that room. It would concern a much more serious question. Did the people around Anneliese try to save her, or did their beliefs prevent them from seeing what was truly happening?
At the beginning, the exorcism was supposed to provide an answer. It was supposed to help explain what was happening to Anneliese Michel. But after months of sessions, another question began to emerge. A much more disturbing question. Were these sessions actually helping her? Between September 1975 and July 1976, the rituals continued, again and again. Some sessions lasted several hours. The recordings continued, the prayers continued, the questioning continued. But while the people around her searched for a spiritual explanation, Anneliese's body began showing the consequences of what was happening. She lost weight. She became weaker and weaker. Her physical condition deteriorated. She also suffered injuries connected to the sessions and to her overall state. For her family, these changes were interpreted in a very specific way. They believed Anneliese was going through an extremely difficult battle, that her suffering was the consequence of what was happening during the exorcisms. For them, the fact that she continued fighting was even seen as a sign that the process was still ongoing. But for others, the situation told a completely different story. They saw a young woman who was already vulnerable, a person with known medical issues, a person who was becoming weaker while the sessions continued. And a question began to emerge. Why did nobody stop this process earlier? Then came July 1976. Anneliese Michel was 23 years old. Her condition had become extremely serious. She was severely weakened. But despite this, the sessions continued. On July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel died at her family home in Klingenberg, Germany. And from that moment, the nature of the case completely changed. Until then, the debate had mainly been about interpretation, a question of belief, a question of medicine. But after her death, a much more difficult question appeared. Could she have been saved? An investigation was opened. Authorities examined the circumstances surrounding her death, and quickly, attention turned toward the people who had been around her during the final months of her life, her parents, but also the two priests who had participated in the exorcism sessions. All of them were accused of contributing to her death through negligence. The trial that followed would become almost as controversial as the case itself, because it was not only judging individuals, it was judging two completely different visions of the world. On one side, the defense argued that Anneliese's parents and the priests were sincerely convinced they were helping her. They were not trying to harm her. They believed they were trying to save her. According to them, they were facing a situation they considered extraordinary. But the prosecution presented another interpretation. According to them, Anneliese was suffering from a medical condition that required a different type of care. The people around her should have prioritized medical treatment instead of continuing the sessions. The central question became, at what point can a belief become dangerous? During the trial, the testimonies were divided. Some described a family desperately searching for an answer. Others described a situation where a vulnerable young woman did not receive the help she needed. And in the middle of this conflict, one question remained impossible to fully resolve. Were the people around Anneliese facing something they could not understand, or did they interpret a real human suffering in a way that prevented medical intervention? The court eventually reached its decision. Anneliese's parents and the two priests were found guilty of negligent homicide. But their sentences were limited. The justice system recognized their responsibility while also taking into account that the people involved genuinely believed they were trying to help. But this decision did not end the debate. Instead,
It transformed Anneliese Michel into a symbol. For some, she represents a person confronted with a phenomenon beyond human explanation. For others, she represents a tragedy where fear, suffering, and beliefs took priority over medicine. But one question continues to return, the same question that has existed since the beginning of this investigation. What was really on those tapes? Because even after her death, the recordings continued to be listened to. Some people hear the proof of an unexplained event. Others hear the suffering of a young woman. And perhaps the true mystery of this case is not only found in the voices recorded on those tapes. Perhaps it is found in a much harder question. How far can someone go when they believe they have found the answer, before they are certain they truly understand the problem? After Anneliese Michel's death, many people might have thought this case would slowly disappear. But the exact opposite happened, because the recordings made during the sessions would transform this story into a debate that would continue for decades. On one side, some people would search within these tapes for proof of a phenomenon that could not be explained. On the other, researchers, doctors, and observers would try to understand what these recordings truly revealed about Anneliese's condition and the people around her. And this is what makes these tapes so unique. In many mysterious cases, all that remains are memories, testimonies told years later, stories that change over time. But in the case of Anneliese Michel, there is a direct record. Hours of recordings captured while the events were happening. Voices, questions, answers. A document that anyone can listen to and interpret in completely different ways. For some people, these tapes represent one of the most disturbing documents ever connected to an exorcism. They hear changes in voices, exchanges that seem unusual, answers that, according to them, do not sound like the behavior of a single person. For them, the recordings tell the story of a presence that went beyond human explanation. But when the case is examined with distance, another reality appears. The same tapes that convince some people do not convince everyone. Because a recording does not show everything. It does not show the years that came before the sessions. It does not show Anneliese's physical and psychological condition. It does not show the deep beliefs of her family and the priests inside that room. It only captures a moment that can be interpreted in different ways. And perhaps this is the central question of the entire case. The question is not only, what do we actually hear on these tapes? The question is also, what did the people inside that room truly believe they were experiencing? Were the priests who participated in the sessions facing something they could not explain? Or did they interpret an extremely complex human situation through their spiritual worldview? Was Anneliese's family simply looking for a possession to believe in? Or were they desperately searching for an answer to a situation that seemed beyond anything they understood? And Anneliese herself may be the most difficult question of all, because behind every theory, there was a person, a 23-year-old young woman, not just a case file, not just audio recordings, not just a story about exorcism, a person with dreams, with plans, with a normal life before her name became connected to one of the most controversial cases in modern history. Today, nearly 50 years after these events, the Anneliese Michel case continues to divide people. Some listen to these recordings and believe they hear proof of a presence that cannot be explained. Others hear the tragic testimony of suffering that was not understood in time. But perhaps that is exactly what makes this case so disturbing, because this story is not only about exorcism, it is about the way human beings search for answers when they encounter something they cannot understand. When we face something unexplained, do we first search for a rational explanation? Do we look for a spiritual answer? Or do we simply search for an explanation that already matches what we believe? The Anneliese Michel tapes still exist. They continue to be listened to. They continue to create debate. They continue to divide opinions. But perhaps the true mystery is not only what they contain. Perhaps the true mystery is what they reveal about ourselves. Because two people can listen to exactly the same recording, hear exactly the same words, and still reach two completely opposite conclusions. And maybe that is why, nearly 50 years later, the Anneliese Michel case has never disappeared. Because ultimately, the question is not only about what was present inside that room. The question is about what we are willing to believe when we are confronted with something we cannot explain. I want to know your opinion. Do you believe the Anneliese Michel tapes show a phenomenon we still cannot explain? Or do you think they reveal, above all, the tragedy of a young woman in suffering, surrounded by people who truly believed they had found the right answer? Tell me also which element of this investigation affected you the most. If you enjoy investigations into mysterious cases, unexplained events, and stories that continue to divide experts, subscribe to support the channel and follow our future investigations. Turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when a new episode is released. Leave a like if you found this case interesting, and share this video with someone who enjoys mysteries and unexplained cases. My name is Victor. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.